I've learned that at any gathering of attorneys, you can always tell those that are entertainment because they are the worst dressed. And it has been my goal to maintain that tradition here at Chapman. Fortunately, though, after 3 years, they still invited me back, and I've really enjoyed teaching at Chapman, much more than I ever anticipated. It started out as a lark, an invitation to teach a little bit of what I used to do, and it has become really a new career that I'm enjoying much more than any other career I had before. But it's what I did before that qualified me to teach what I do now. And it all started out as a deal. It's a deal I made with my dad, where he wanted me to go to law school and I wanted to go into entertainment. So he said, if you go into law school, if you're good enough for them to hire you, you can teach it, you can practice entertainment law. I made that deal. And at the time, it was a rather unusual deal because entertainment law, I'm an old guy, didn't really exist in the form that it does today. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I went to the University of Utah. And they don't teach entertainment law now. I mean, they do a little, but they certainly didn't then, and no school taught it at the time. So it was something that I really didn't learn, but was hoping to develop eventually as I went to school. At the University of Utah, though, I had an opportunity that kind of took me further into that field. They offered a campus-wide fellowship for anybody who was interested in going to work for ABC News for about 6 weeks as an intern, which I took. I felt very special in doing it until I discovered that only 3 other students had applied for it. But during law school, during the first 6 weeks of my second semester of my second year, I went back to DC to the Washington News Bureau and was able to go on the beat with any correspondent anywhere in the city, including the White House. Of course, I went to the White House a lot. And in those days, Sam Donaldson was the chief White House correspondent. I spent a lot of time with Ted Koppel. And as a result of that time, I thought at that moment, maybe I don't want to go back to law school. I'm liking this too much. And in fact, I made a proposal to the head of the Washington News Bureau, and that I was proposing something that kind of eventually looked like 2020. Although I can't take credit for that. He thought it was a pretty good idea, but he said, yeah, hey kid, why don't you go back to Salt Lake, cut an audition tape, and we'll see where it goes. So I went back to Salt Lake, rung up my dad again, who was kind of paying for my law school, and I said, I want to drop out. I want to become a news guy. And he said no. So I went back to law school, but I was very glad I did. I did know that coming from Salt Lake City, Utah, my only ticket to go to one of the 2 coasts where I could get into entertainment or news was to do well. So I worked hard and made law review and got a few invitations to interview at some firms in LA. The firm that I picked was a firm by the name of Music, Peter and Garrett, who at the time had the Getty estate. And they also had another client that was very interesting to me. They had 20th Century Fox. I thought finally this was my opportunity. So I went down to LA, passed the bar, became a part of the firm. And as they do when you join big corporate law firms, they have you kind of rotate through the various departments, real estate and litigation and labor and health. There was no entertainment section because I learned that the only thing they did for 20th Century Fox was pension work. That was not what I wanted to do. So I then set about to do the very thing that we teach and encourage the students to do here, and that was to network. So I started attending all the seminars, and I would introduce myself to a lot of people who really couldn't care less, until I finally met a guy who told me that they were maybe hiring an entry-level guy at Columbia. And that was rare, because one of the problems that students constantly face who want to go into entertainment is that they don't want to hire anybody who hasn't had experience, but you can't get experience until somebody hires you. This was a guy who was willing to hire somebody cheap. I was willing to work for cheap. And it was at Columbia. But I knew that there would be real competition as soon as the word got out, so I left the seminar. I immediately went and spiked my resume, told no lies, I don't remember, got my resume in good shape, and then that very next morning I went to, at the time it was called the Burbank Studios, it's now the Warner lot, and this was before 9/11. I talked myself onto the lot. I explained that I was a courier with a very important letter for Phil Breen, head of legal at Columbia Pictures. They let me on. And I remember being fascinated because I was this kid from Salt Lake City, Utah, driving onto this lot, this Hollywood lot, and seeing, everything that I'd only seen in pictures. Found my way back to the administrative building. door was unlocked. Found my way back all the way to Mr. Breen's office, door was unlocked, and I put my resume on his chair. And that was Saturday. On Monday, when he arrived at work, he was so amused that I got my resume on his chair that he called me right up, and I lucked out and got hired. That's how I got started. But I do emphasize it because it's not always just high scores. It's kind of being a little innovative and a little gutsy, but never lie to a guard, not since 9/11. I shouldn't have passed that along. But anyway, so I started at Columbia, and it was a great experience because the first thing you do as a studio attorney is they just give you a picture to start working, and they give you contracts with famous names you've heard of your whole life, and you go to work. And because you're not taught entertainment law or transactional law in the entertainment field in law school, you learn it on the job. And within a year, I was given an invitation to go over to Fox, as Dean Campbell mentioned, and that was during the Star Wars years. And that's when I was really thrown into the fire. The good news was that the head of legal at 20th Century Fox at the time was really the dean of entertainment law. He taught his students really well, and his students being the lawyers. And that's where I really got my education in entertainment law. One of the things I learned, and this is the great thing about it being an entertainment lawyer, not that being a sports agent is bad or working with video games, but entertainment really is what it's all about. Because if you work at a studio, you're at the center of that whole process. Because when you make movies, it involves two things that are most critical, and that's rights and deals. And the attorney or the legal department, they are at the center of all that. They're the people that interact with the creative people who want to buy all the scripts, hundreds, thousands of them that hopefully will make it into a movie. They're the ones that are at the center of the negotiations when a few are picked for whom you hire producers and directors, eventually actors. They're the ones that are at the center when you're dealing with physical production. You make the movies and you have to enter into all the contracts and make certain those that you did enter into are observed. And they're the ones that deal with accounting, because in the end it's all about money. And as you've probably heard, Hollywood is legendary for keeping its money and being very tricky in its back-end definitions, something you need to learn as a studio attorney. I really loved that. I enjoyed that job. However, after a while, I had an opportunity to go back to Utah because I was from Utah, made a mistake, went back, didn't last long. Then I had an even better opportunity. At Universal Pictures, they were looking for a new head of legal. And I really wasn't a good candidate for it, but I knew the right guy who was a young candidate, and he too didn't know what he was doing. So he hired me so that we could both keep our secrets. But one of the reasons he hired me is really relevant to what happens in the entertainment business. And that is that once you start at a studio or you're involved in the transactional practice of entertainment law, it's exciting at first, it's interesting at first, but then eventually it gets old because it's the same drill over and over and over again in a very small community where you're trading, the same kind of comments and making the same kind of revisions over and over again. And we had some really smart people in our department, and it seemed to me to be a waste to hire these people and use their talents for stuff that eventually they could do with their eyes closed. So I developed a system where we could computerize as much as possible, and that was a scary word in those days. The whole procedure of documenting deals that were made. And mind you, when you're a studio lawyer, you're only documenting deals, you're not making them. So in developing that, they were interested at Universal in incorporating that. And so I was hired really before I should have been to head up the legal at Universal Pictures, and I did that for 7 years. That too eventually got boring, because you are still, even though you automated the system, you weren't really at the heart of the movie making process. And I have to confess, being a lawyer is great, but being a lawyer, my bias, where you're involved in an enterprise that is creating something and you're working with creative people, that is what I enjoyed the most. And those people who do that in any kind of motion picture or television endeavor are what they call business affairs executives. And they are usually, almost always, graduated attorneys. Those positions are few and far between, and again, I lucked out, really didn't deserve it. I knew the right guy at the right time, and I was hired over at New Line Cinema to head up their business and legal affairs. And that began, I think, the next 15 best years of my life. I almost enjoyed it as much as I'm enjoying teaching here at Chapman. During that time, I was blessed to be very much a part of some exciting adventures, particularly Lord of the Rings, and I took that ride. Well, that was 15 years, and eventually all good things come to an end, as did New Line Cinema, because in the competitive world and during a tough economy, Warner Brothers absorbed New Line, and I was just about ready to do something else anyway, so it wasn't too bad. And I was invited at the time to, would you consider maybe coming to Chapman by a good colleague of mine who was teaching here then. And I didn't know what I was going to teach. But then I remembered that I had created a game that when I was at New Line, we were part of the Time Warner family, and we would go to these really dull weekend retreats where we would have, I'm going to offend somebody here and I apologize, some FCC lawyer kind of drone on about the new regulations. I'm sorry. Dean Campbell was in the government. He may have written some of those laws. But I wanted to make it a little more interesting. And so I created this game called Studiopoly. And that was, and all the attorneys at New Line and at Warner Brothers gathered together. And even though you're working at the studio and you have for years, you still don't know a lot of the basics that go into making the decision to make a movie. Those are the economics. Those are what the business affairs people learn. So I took them through, I told them, I divided them up in groups. They were each a studio, and they were to compete with each other, and they were given $150 million. Back then it was a lot of money. And they were to pick a slate, and then and that slate was based upon projects that had actually been written up at Disguise that were real projects, so I could look later to see if these pictures succeeded or not. For example, they would pick a military movie with John Travolta with a certain kind of budget, and they would decide which ones they would pick among a choice of 12. And then after they did that, we would see, who made the best guess. Well, it doesn't take, there's a very famous saying in Hollywood, and that is that nobody knows anything. That was from William Goldman, who wrote a book called Adventures in the Screenwriting Trade, but it is really true. But you can know a little more than the other guy if you begin to understand the economics. Well, this was introducing to the attorneys a little bit more of the process they needed to understand to be better at their job, and certainly for the business affairs executives to know what they do. Well, that's what I teach. Because I took that game here and I modified it and created a whole course out of it, where we go into all the revenue streams that make up all the economics of the motion picture industry, which are changing dramatically now and make it even more interesting. And also all the deals that are brokered within each of those revenue streams. That is what I teach, and I try to do it in a dynamic, interesting way, where I walk them through the whole process of what they would need to know to go to work first day and know what they were doing in a studio legal department, or even at a production company, or any aspect of the motion picture and television industry where they are making deals and acquiring rights. So that's what I do, and I love what I do. There's some other things, but I think I'm going on a little long. But I want you to know that right before I decided to take on this experiment of teaching, I looked up one of the attorneys who used to work for me who taught at USC, because I wanted to see what it was like. And I sat in the back of his class along with about 15 other guys who were on their computers not paying a lot of attention, and I thought, oh man, I don't know if I want to do this, because their attitude was not great. So I didn't know what kind of attitude I was going to run into at Chapman. I've taught here for 3 years, and I've never had that experience. What I enjoy at Chapman is that the students who come here really want to be here. And that creates a much more dynamic classroom environment, because the class is really only as good as the students in it, and to the extent that they interact with each other and contribute. That's why I love it. My job is simple. I just try to get them talking, and then we teach each other. So thank you.